Good afternoon, and welcome to our panel, Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote. I'd like to begin by honoring the Native American ancestral lands where Indiana University was built. These include the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee Peoples' lands. Also, I'd like to give thanks to the collaborating units for today's event. And I should introduce myself for a moment. My name is Lisa Marie Napoli, and I'm the director of the Political and Civic Engagement PACE program. So the other collaborators for today's event, in addition to PACE, is the League of Women Voters, Bloomington-Monroe County, the African American and African Diaspora Studies, Department of History, Department of Gender Studies, Arts and Humanities Council, and the Themester, Democracy 2020. So we're grateful for all of these collaborators for today's special event. And as many of you know, over the past month, there have been many announcements and events acknowledging the passage of the 19th Amendment, granting the women the right to vote. Today's panel discussion borrows the title from a newly published book called Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote, written by Ellen Carroll Du Bois, who's a distinguished researcher, professor at the History Department of UCLA. So here is the book, if any of you have seen it or would like to see it. Today's discussion might provoke you to want to get your hands on it. It's quite a great read. So the author has written many other books, and there's a prior version of this one as well. But for today, we will use this text as a launching point, assuming that our viewers, like you, have not read the book yet. Many of you may have, but maybe not. So we're going to use the text primarily as a touchstone for today's discussion. And we have a wonderful panel that I am delighted to introduce to you today. So with that, I'd like to start with the first introduction with Maria Bucur. And I'd like to introduce her for a moment and then have her talk briefly about the book, and then we will pull everyone in and I will give the rest of the introductions. So Maria is a professor of East European history and gender studies. She teaches courses on transnational feminist debates, gender, history, memory, gender and Marxism, among other topics. Her books and other writings have focused on the history of eugenics, war and memory in the 20th century, citizenship and gender under communism and post-communism, and gender and modernism. Recently, she completed a book manuscript that offers an intersectional gender analysis of how the veterans programs reshaped the meaning and practice of citizenship in Romania during the 20th century. So Maria, would you give us a brief overview of the book, and then I will pull in the rest of our panelists and begin a great discussion.
Thank you, Lisa Marie, and thank you so much for the kind introduction. I want to say a few words about the book before we get into a discussion. As Lisa Marie mentioned, Suffrage was published earlier this year by Ellen Carroll Du Bois. Until 2017, Du Bois was a professor of history at UCLA, and she focused her work on U.S. women's history. During her long career, she published a large number of studies and several books that focus on various aspects of women's movements in the United States, inclusive of the fight for suffrage, as well as class relations among women activists and other related topics. The book Suffrage represents thus a synthesis of sorts of her previous findings, with an eye on a non-expert audience. It came out as a trade book. As such, the story is presenting through a lively narrative that includes many vignettes about individual activists and a description of some of the debates among historians that have taken place about the meaning of and the quality of the specific activities in the discussion of the author. At the heart of Du Bois's narrative are the group of overwhelmingly white, middle-class, educated women that form the core personnel and several strands of the struggle for women's suffrage in the United States. The narrative starts with the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention and ends with the 19th Amendment, with a brief epilogue that reflects on the significance of the 19th Amendment over the next 100 years. Her gaze is generally appreciative, focusing on obstacles these women faced, the kinds of alliances they were able to forge, and the enormous learning curve that several generations of such leaders underwent in their quest to successfully legalize women's right to vote. In the course of reading the book, we become intimately acquainted with the slow process of ratification, state by state, of women's voting rights, as well as with the successive types of backlash that success has brought about. In the process, we also become acquainted with the weaknesses of this movement. Racism is one of the important problems touched on, but not fully integrated in the story. We'll hear more about that later. Relations between nativists and immigrants is another issue of some focus. And of course, the issue of misogyny is always present, though not necessarily made explicit. In the process of reading this book, one becomes more appreciative about the political complexities of the goal and the paths taken to secure women's suffrage, and about the hard education that suffragists underwent in order to develop successful strategies for persuading their opponents of the righteousness of their cause. Some of these strategies included pandering to deeply racist attitudes, if not outright embracing them, which were common, especially in the South, but not only. And thus, the book in effect presents us with an important reminder about the substantial costs of those strategies and of upholding a view of democracy that excludes non-white women. As a final note, I thought it remarkable that the word feminism appears only twice in the book. There's almost no explicit claim that the suffrage movement in the United States was in fact feminist. I will leave it to my co-panelists, experts in US history and culture, to comment more directly on the degree to which Du Bois successfully presents a comprehensive and appropriately critical narrative about the nature of these developments and their outcome. I will return at the end of this round with some words about the international linkages of the suffrage movement in the United States. And with that, I pass it back to you, Lisa Marie.
Thank you very much, Maria. That was a great synopsis of the book. And thank you also, I don't know if I mentioned, for being inspired by the book and your leadership to pull us all together. So we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you. Thank you. All right, so I'd like to introduce, we have 3 more panelists who will be joining us. I will introduce them 1, 2, 3, and then we'll come together and we'll figure out our next step to share our responses to the book. So Anne Birch is next, and Anne earned a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. She was a research chemist for Dow Chemical Company in Midland, Michigan for 11 years before leaving Dow and founding a technical communications firm. Her husband, Jim, a chemical engineer, joined the business 4 years later. They worked together as freelance technical writers and editors for 30 years. Both are now retired, moving to Bloomington in 2013. We're glad they're here. Anne has since become active in the League of Women Voters of Bloomington-Monroe County and is currently president and also chair of the Communications Committee. Thank you, Anne, for being here.
Thank you.
And we have Carolyn Calloway-Thomas. Carolyn is a past president of the World Communication Association, as well as professor and chair of African American and African Diaspora Studies. Her teaching and research areas are public dialogue in Black America, gender, intercultural communication, pedagogy of empathy, and civic engagement. Her books and other writings center on empathy in the global world, intercultural communication, and African Americans' ventures in cultural and social change through public discourse. She is currently working on a book-length manuscript on African American women titled, What If I Am a Woman? Her national awards include a Ford Postdoctoral Fellowship, a Fulbright Scholarship to Nigeria, West Africa, a Carnegie Scholarship, the National Communication Association's Robert J. Kibler Award, and the Samuel L. Becker Distinguished Service Award, and the Distinguished Alumni Award from Grambling State University, among other achievements. Thank you so much for being here, Carolyn. And finally, last but not least, Janine Giordano Drake. Janine is a specialist in U.S. labor, religious women's, cultural, and intellectual history. She is author to a number of articles and book chapters, including a book manuscript in progress that explore the rivalries among the many social movements of the late 19th century, including the women's movement, the labor movement, the populist movement, temperance, socialism, and the social gospel. Here at IU, she splits her time between the history department and the advanced college project, IU's dual enrollment program in U.S. history. Thank you for being here, Janine. Great. Wonderful panel today. And now that we've done our introductions and Maria has given us an overview of the book, now we get to it. Thank you again for all being here. I'd like to start our conversation today by having each of you share your own personal takeaways, your emphasis of what stood out to you based on your reading of the book Suffrage. We will move to questions after that point that I will lead for a while. And then those of you in Facebook land, please be sure to start sending your questions as they come up. Thanks to the assistance of Joey Meyer, we have her to take those questions and send them our way for further discussion toward the end. But you can send in your questions at any time. And we are aiming for a spirit of respect and constructive growth and knowledge in this discourse today. So we're going to begin the responses. Again, the personal takeaways will begin with Ann Birch, and each panelist will speak for about 2 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you. You know, one of the signs that I was not only enjoying the book, but I was absorbing it was I started to mark down references that she gave so that I could follow some of the paths that she set. I think that compared to other books on similar topics, one of the things that she accomplished was to humanize the main figures, give you a better idea of what their motives were, and also clearly expose a lot of the conflicts that were present during the suffrage movement. Although she discussed racism, and this is something Maria referred to earlier, that was a part of the suffrage movement, I think she could have covered that and the main figures involved more extensively, especially regarding Native Americans and Hispanic women. One thing I do wish is that she had gone outside of the typical time period of the 1848 convention to the 1920 ratification, because I really don't believe that is where the suffrage, or I shouldn't say the suffrage movement, but really the seeking suffrage began. She did mention Abigail Adams' entreaty to her husband to not forget the ladies, rather briefly. But if you Google that, if you're not familiar with that quote, it's a marvelous quote, and it was in 1776. So it was a good sign that no one waited till 1848 before they started looking for the vote. One thing I noted is that the author had a kind of a whirlwind epilogue, and Maria referred to this also, that covered the years after 1920, and I actually think it was pretty successful, except I felt as a reader like I was flying through it. It passed through so much time. I kind of wish she'd done something similar with the years before 1848 to kind of set the pace and bring up some of the characters that happened before Seneca Falls. One thing that stands out for me as a major takeaway is the understanding of just how organized, calculated, and strategized the movement was. You know, how surprisingly politically astute these women were, which is another sign to me that they started thinking about it before 1848 came along. And also how much they understood about public relations and how much that came into their plans. It looked like they knew they were making history. And so they photographed it, they documented to make sure that it went into the history books. Although in recent years, that history has been very carefully examined and is often being corrected. And I think that that is an important point. One last area I'm concerned about that would be emphasis for me is a question. Why does exclusion seem to mark every social and political justice movement, including the suffrage movement?
Great question. We will explore more in a little bit. Next, we'd like to hear from Carolyn, please.
Thank you, Lisa Marie. It took a dedicated group of disorderly women to break the iron cages that imposed upon them a metaphorical social death, which enjoined them to silence. Du Bois' book, Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote, with its aptly used war metaphor, is a pretty convincing portrait of the towering, disorderly women who worked valiantly to enrich our understanding of what is required for women's voices to be heard and to be taken seriously. There are many fascinating aspects of the book, but I was most captivated by the uses of the human voice, how the women marshaled their core arguments, rebranded themselves, framed their appeals, and used moving pathos in their zeal to vote to say definitively, we are here on this patch of ground, the United States of America, and we are determined to be heard, and they were heard through resilience, persistence, and dutifulness. But along the way, Du Bois's analysis also brings to the foreground some of the nasty, messy, but urgent issues that still confront us today, including immigration, racial domination, class division, the reality of relational experiences, and a jockeying for who gets to be privileged first in the arena of civil and human rights in a largely hierarchical world controlled by the ruling class. We also see pretty vividly how women, Stanton, Stone, Wells Barnett, Truth, and others just stood their ground and marched and taught, persuaded, preached, demonstrated, and petitioned men in their long stride toward freedom and the right to vote. We hear about Lucy Stone and other women holding secret club meetings deep in the woods in the cabin of a local African-American woman in order to teach themselves the skills of public speaking. This was done because Oberlin College and other universities denied women the right to learn what the hushed word, the preached word, the whispered in the night word, and the political word could do in the sustained interests of women's suffrage and human liberation. Strikingly, we see women going to the Declaration of Independence and using it as a touchstone for the Declaration of Sentiments, which they presented at a groundbreaking conference in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. As Du Bois notes persuasively, women used both the language and legitimacy of the Declaration of Independence as a way out of their confining spaces and places. Further, as Du Bois makes clear again and again, the right to vote was so compelling, such that women sometimes bickered, screamed, fought among themselves, and used every available means of persuasion: newspapers, broadsides, laws, dramatic techniques, plays, and petitions to carry on their public business as they methodically and strategically moved men toward women's vision of how the demands of a right to vote ought to be met and resolved. Finally, Du Bois' work tells the resilient narrative of women's suffrage and the long, unyielding road that brought us thus far along the way. And it also echoes Seeley's existential anguish in Alice Walker's The Color Purple. Recall the precise moving moment where Seeley says, I may be ... but I am here. We are here, celebrating women's suffrage.
Thank you. Such a great visual and vivid way to see that time and what happened in the book. Thank you very much. And Janine, would you like to go next, please?
Yes, thank you. So, oh, sorry, I'm pulling this up. Yes, I really like the book. Oh, sorry, one more time here. But I was struck by the ways that it's different from Ellen Du Bois's 1978 Feminism and Suffrage, the Emergence of an Independent Women's Movement in America, 1848 to 1869, which Ellen Du Bois wrote in 1978. The previous book was a hard look at feminists' search for allies within the two-party system. Feminists sought allies among Republicans or Democrats and the labor movement, but they found that each relationship asked the suffragettes to compromise their goals. The part of the book that really stuck out to me was Du Bois's exploration of the short-lived alliance between suffragettes and the ardent white supremacists of the Democratic Party, folks who wanted to see African Americans disfranchised. I think I'm saying her name correctly, but Ellen Du Bois, or Dubois, is responsible for introducing many of us to the deep racism that characterized the early suffragettes through this book. And I'm sure that this book was one inspiration for Louise Newman's book called White Women's Rights, The Racial Origins of Feminism in the United States. But in many respects, her 2020 book, Suffrage, that we're talking about today, this is an expanded version of this 1978 book, but it leaves out a lot of what I thought was really interesting and provoking about that 1978 book. Her new book is much more celebratory of the first generation of feminists than her 1978 book. Instead of revealing a suffrage movement that's struggling for direction, her suffragettes in this new book are largely like modern intellectuals. They're building coalition in a sort of self-conscious commitment to an intersectional alliance. In the previous book, they're mostly white women, and they're really not teaming up with African-American women. In her new book, she's finding that the suffrage movement was actually a sort of a different thing, that it was much more intersectional from the beginning. Both of these narratives can be true. And I think in some ways, this is not a critique, this is just recognizing that we've done a lot of research over the past 20 years to arrive at a different point of perspective on the suffrage movement. But I also think I would love to discuss why our 2020 celebrations of the women's suffrage movement sort of paper over these early stories of desperation that we used to tell in the 1970s. And I think it's interesting to think about how what she said in the 70s is also still true, that the suffrage movement was also filled with a lot of moments of inclarity, of desperation, of desperately seeking allies and not really having any clear direction at all. And we sort of lose some of that in her new book, in her new edition of the book in some ways. So I would say I enjoyed the book for a lot of the same reasons other people mentioned. But I especially like the way that she is weaving in various regional histories of the suffrage movement, which we've learned over the last 20 years, especially the history of suffrage in the West. But I finished the book unconvinced of the broader narrative that Du Bois offers. That is, she's suggesting that the second generation of suffragettes, the ones who passed the 19th Amendment, actually saw themselves having something in common with the women who wrote that Declaration of Sentiments in 1848 and the women who wrote the 1876 Declaration on the Rights of Women. And she's suggesting that this is actually one long story of suffrage. And I'm not quite convinced that that's a fair story to tell. That there really is one long story of suffrage, that the women of 1919 really do see themselves building firmly on the shoulders of the previous generation. And so I'll just say a little bit about that. By 1919, the racial and cultural composition of the United States is so different from what it was 50 and 70 years earlier. By 1919, the United States had a well-developed industrial sector powered by European immigrants and African-American migrants. And it was in many respects an entirely different country culturally, in terms of its own cultural origins, in terms of its own women that it's building upon, from the one that contemplated the Declaration of Sentiments in 1848. And I say this sort of as someone who comes from the field of labor history. When we tell the story of the labor movement in 1919, we don't go back to the working men's parties of 1848, because we see that those workers as sort of part of a different culture, as responding to different cultural stimuli than those workers in 1919. We hardly even go back to the Pullman strike to explain 1919, because World War I and the labor movement of 1919 was really changed the cultural perspective, the strategic alliances that we're building, the politics of the world in 1919 was really already a different world than it was in 1912. And when I look at the 19th Amendment, I often think about how the coalitions that were built to make that suffrage movement in the moment of feminism, say between 1950 and 1919, is really such a different moment that deserves a different context than the previous efforts to build a women's movement and the previous efforts to build women's suffrage into the Constitution. So I guess that's basically what I want to say, that why in 2020 are we not comfortable with this 1970s narrative, the story of suffragettes who are sort of bumbling along and struggling for allies and fumbling for any sort of alliances they could build? Why do we want to tell a story that's sort of teleological, that has women sort of always clear-headed and always self-aware of the strategies that they're building? That is what I ultimately find really interesting, but not entirely convincing about the narrative that presented in this book.
Okay, thank you for that comparison, Janine. Appreciate it. And one more personal takeaway from Maria. What is your perspective on the book? You're on mute.
Yeah, I feel like I want to answer Janine's question first and then go to my takeaway, because you really made me, can you hear me?
Yes, very briefly you could respond, and then we want to just,
No, yeah, it's part of, sort of the takeaway. I think that the difference between the 1970s and now is the way we think about historical agency, right? Has shifted in the way that we speak about, coming to power, and sort of a different kind of language has evolved. But I think the outcome of creating this linear, somewhat triumphalist story is one that is an unfortunate one, because I think you're absolutely right about the deficiencies of that linearity and the lack of paying attention to the contingency, especially before and during and after the First World War, which kind of changes a lot of things in general. In terms of things that have not been said, because really I am very much in agreement with my my colleagues here. So for me, the minutia, the details of the story about suffrage out west are the most, like this, the Colorado story is really just fascinating. It's a personal thing because my kid just moved to Denver, and so as I was reading this, we were arriving in Denver, and I was, depositing them at college, and I felt like I wanted to run around, and I felt like I rediscovered Denver from the perspective, like, I could see all these suffragists running around, which is, I think, a compliment to the quality of the vividness of her descriptions and the kind of animated story that she tells there, right? And I think, I mean, in all fairness, it's there are moments of not knowing what they're doing in some of those parts of the story, but I do take your point, Janine. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is the performativity aspect of what these women were doing. I think several of you have touched on some parts of this, but to me, the way in which different individuals decide to take on and represent through some way of performing their gender and race, actually, and class, right? But to perform intersectionally their identity really shapes some of the responses. We have the story of the equestrian, right, leader who is, God, I forgot her name.
Inez Holland?
Yes. Who is this, sort of Amazon-like figure, but at the same time, extremely feminine in her self-presentation. I thought that was very interesting how in trying to be forceful, but at the same time to play into certain stereotypes that many of these women really used gender stereotypes to their advantage. When they're picketing outside of the White House, right? They're both sort of inviting people to look at them as women, as respectable women, while at the same time holding up signs that are clearly quite critical of what's happening. So I see a tradition of negotiating these different types of gender stereotypes in a way that I think gets more and more effective over time. And I think there are lessons, you know, and certainly our students are learning those lessons, and I'm always very interested to see how they creatively use them, you know, further. But I found that to be a very interesting part. And also the issue of sort of how these, not all, but many of these women in the portraits that we hear about them are negotiating very complicated lives in which you know, many of them are raising families at the same time that they're trying to travel. Of course, being white and with the wealth that many of them had and the familial support, they are able to negotiate that in ways that, if you're thinking about sort of African American women at the same time, were not available. But still, it's complex sort of stories of many different forces pulling and pushing on them, and for instance, with regard to the kind of sexual criteria for being a pure woman or not, there's some interesting stories about that as well, and the confrontation that appears at times between leaders with regard to that in how the movement evolves. So these are some of the things that stood out to me as particularly interesting in this version of the book.
Okay, wonderful. Well, as usual, I'm left with so many great directions to go in, and just really appreciate how articulate and responsive you are all to the text. I love using it as a basis for this interaction in constructive and, you know, good critical thinking ways too. So thank you all very much. So there's lots of directions to go, and I think I'm going to start for a moment. And I also received some, you know, we've been thinking through some questions as a group, and so I'm going to start with the exclusion piece, because I think that's come up in a variety of different ways from some of you, and Anne, you brought it up earlier when you first were introduced, like, why is it that social movements, you know, typically take off in this sort of exclusionary way to be able to keep that tunnel vision for their cause? Like, why does that have to happen? When it does seems like pulling in more people, you know, seem like building the allyship would be a better way to do it. So I don't know, Anne, if you've been reflecting on it, if you'd like to start, but this isn't, we're going to open up the questions now to the whole group and make it more interactive. So anybody who would like to respond.
Okay. Well, I have thought about this quite a bit, partly because I was raised in the 60s and 70s, so as part of the feminist movement. And they're a very good example of being exclusive for someone who doesn't follow or toe the line. I remember being in college in the late 60s and early 70s, and I went to a primarily male mining and engineering school. And the few women that were in the school were very disdainful of any woman who left to get married, you know, got her MRS degree. They permitted nursing students to come in and take some science courses, and there was a lot of disdain towards the nursing students who were in a traditional female role. So it was a good example of how, you know, you've got this movement that's going for justice, and yet you're pushing other people aside if they don't match exactly the way you're looking at things. One other example is from a quote I heard from a book. I haven't read the book yet, but it's about immigration. And to paraphrase it, it says something like, when immigrants finally get an open door to be included, they go through the door and then they close it firmly behind them.
I think Paul Gilroy might provide some insights into why we have this inclusion-exclusion dichotomy in human relations. In his book, Against Race, he says something that I thought was pretty provocative. He says that whenever we use the perilous pronoun we, that it cannot help but define distinctions between one person over on the left-hand side and another person on the right-hand side. So it means that, for example, when we think of the Constitution of the United States of America, it says we the people of the United States of America. It does not say we the people of China. It does not say we the people of Japan, but rather it says we the people of the United States of America in order to form a more perfect union. So there's something about that perilous pronoun, because it does fence in some individuals and fence out other individuals. We are Democrats. That's a fencing in kind of behavior. My tribe, one person might say, is the Democrat Party. Another person might say, my tribe is the Republican Party. And we talk about these issues in exclusionary language. And we see it so abundantly, so vividly today in how Democrats interact or not interact with Republicans and vice versa. So I think that Paul Gilroy's notion of what happens when we use that collective word we, it cannot help but establish, according to him, over here, over there.
Maria.
So we might be asking, yeah.
I couldn't agree more. I wanted to bring another issue that connects, I think, to what you were saying, also both of you. Women at the beginning of this we that you're describing, Carolyn, are vulnerable, of course not there's several vulnerable categories of communities, right? And the question that one needs to ask is, when you are a vulnerable person, a category of people, part of a category of people, and you're trying to go out and find allies, do you go everywhere or do you go to the people that you trust? Mm-hmm. And in every instance that I've seen in looking at feminist movements, with the exception of the anarchists, who are just on a completely different level of, kind of interaction with ideology, community, and people. But most other people who are in a position of vulnerability, they go to the trusted people that they know could be their allies, right? Many of us do the same thing in our daily practices. Comfort, like if you're already weak, don't spread yourself thinner, right? Mm-hmm. So what that begets, I think, is what are the communities that these women live in, right? Familial, religious, racial, class. So the moment you start doing that, of course, one of the things that happens is that there is self-propelling snowballing effect that happens, in which your allies become more and more people like you. Unless at some point you stop and you make a conscious decision that you need to look after other vulnerable categories of people, because now you have gained enough strength that you don't have to fear for your very existence. And those other people have a very similar, so developing that empathy that sort of goes to the kind of alliances that, we are dreaming of, and that didn't happen, basically. So to me, it's about that kind of, starting at a point of vulnerability and then not taking stock once you gain more ground to really articulate a different kind of strategy, because you're in a different relationship of power, right, with where you started. So that's
perhaps our social relations have not caught up with our hunter-gathering instincts. That during during medieval periods, so you knew how to stay inside that circle, because if you did not stay inside that circle, you might risk death.
Well, if you were African American, for sure, yeah.
I think this is such an interesting conversation to me, because I think what you're suggesting is we can't fault people for building community with the people that they know and like and rely upon, because that's your first starting point for building any sort of movement at all. But the other side, so I'm still thinking about that. I'm not rejecting that argument. But on the other hand, like, I don't see those women in that first generation of suffrage in 1848 to 1850 something or 60 something as actually wanting the same type of women's equality as the women of, say, the 19-teens and 1920s. Like those, like in the Declaration of Sentiments, it says things about how women can't be in ministry. But there were literally lots of nuns in the 1840s all over North America. Like they were really talking about Protestant women in the white Protestant world. They're not actually talking about the rights of all women in the Americas at all. And so I don't really think it's fair to say. I think it's giving them too much rope. I don't know. I don't think really it's fair to say that they were just building community and building movement based on the people they knew. I think they were only looking for a certain kind of liberation, and they were not looking for a different kind of liberation. And therefore, I don't see the 20th century feminist movement really having as much in common with that early women's suffrage movement as Du Bois suggests that we should see.
Janine, may I say this with regard to the fencing in and fencing out behavior that took place? I think that the 15th Amendment played a commanding role. It actually framed the discourse at the beginning of the women's suffrage movement, because a lot of the discussion was centered on, should African American men have rights before white women? And so I think that 15th Amendment sort of framed it, and people began to box themselves inside that center, inside that geographic space, instead of doing what you're suggesting. You know, at any moment they could have popped out and found, you know, some new alliances or new ways of behaving and thinking, but they did not, because we cannot underestimate the power of framing in our lives. Look at what is going on in the United States of America at this very, very moment with Black Lives Matter, and how Black Lives Matter has framed how we see the world and how it's managing our consciousness in significant ways. So I just wanted to put that on the table. I write on empathy, and I see your impulse toward empathy, but I also say there is a dark side of empathy.
One thing that I found interesting that was not really covered at a large extent in this book, but has been in other books and articles, is the conversations between Frederick Douglass and the leaders of the suffrage movement, some of whom he was very close to, he was very good friends with, over the 15th Amendment. And the fact that they thought there should be no amendment at all unless it included women. And I think you're correct. You know, we're really seeing white women. And Frederick Douglass was saying, you know, progress is progress, you know, any foot in the door is going to be beneficial to everybody. And that really caused a rift between Douglass and some of the main leaders of the movement.
And Stanton was fierce in her language, wasn't she?
Yeah.
In terms of being accepting of African American men and their vote. I mean, I cringed when I read Du Bois' book and some of the statements that Stanton made.
That's true of Carrie Chapman Catt too.
Yes.
With belonging to the League of Women Voters, I particularly feel that, since she was the founder.
I know. And it also demonstrates the nature of hypocrisy, and how people can be theoretical people and put the theory on one side and the practice on another, and never have the twain meeting together and saying, let's be happy. Let's make reconciliation between what you're theorizing about and what you're actually practicing.
So in that same spirit, especially in thinking about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Carrie Chapman Catt, you know, these women were very white middle class women. So let's think of it and a little bit about, and I know a couple of you have had an interest in like the distinction between that group sort of leaving out the working class, right? And how that tension was happening during the movement too. And I'm just going to share a few words to move into a question here. So Du Bois's book captures nicely the social cues that women had to consider in promoting the work of women's suffrage, from how they dressed to how they spoke, right? Suggesting a pristinely middle-class movement, including the presence of Black women. And as we know, the book had a lot of middle-class women, as we just mentioned, and others. So in light of the large prevalence of middle-class women in the movement, to what extent can a case be made for changing the title of Du Bois's book to Suffrage, the Middle-Class Woman's Long Battle for the Vote? Is this book truly a fair representation of women in general? What do you all think?
That is such a good question. I think that's it. I laugh because it's like an obvious point, but it's such a brilliant point to say that maybe we could just name it as a middle class movement. But of course it's an Anglo Protestant middle class movement, right? And maybe they're the same, but like to me, they're really important for a certain period. And then the 20th century feminism, 1915, they could not get suffrage on their own. They depended on solidarities with the European working classes, basically, with the immigrant working classes. And so, like, if that's the story that we're going to tell, she needs another chapter on, you know, the Women's Trade Union League and all of the anarchist women and the socialist women and all these radical Europeans who come over and say, like, we're going to get it done and we're going to get it done now, and who build solidarities, because I don't think that this would have happened without them. And yet they don't really get a lot of agency, as Maria mentioned, in this book.
And yet had Du Bois just focused on the circle of privilege, and many of these women, as we know, were within that circle of privilege.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I was hugely disappointed that Du Bois did not, even within the circle of privilege, African-American circle of privilege, even deign to include Maria Stuart, who was the first American-born woman, Black or white, according to my historical consciousness, to utter a political argument. And by that I mean the first woman to speak in front of a promiscuous audience, meaning an audience comprised of male and female. And so I wondered why Du Bois would just negate the beauty and elegance of Maria Stuart, who wrote a speech called "What If I Am a Woman?" And she marshaled a cogent argument. She went to the Bible, she went to classical allusions, she went to history. I mean, it's just a very beautiful way of marshaling evidence. And yet, she's silent in that book.
I have to confess that I'm not familiar with that person. When was she speaking?
1833. She really went on the platform for about 3 years. And she was such a religious person, so maybe her religiosity worked against her, because she used lots of biblical metaphors, you know, girding my lion, you know, breastplate of righteousness, and those sorts of things. But I was very disappointed that she did not get much play in the book, if any.
That sounds like that missing piece that Anne was referring to in her introductory remarks prior to 1848. So Maria,
we just don't know these people.
Well, we are starting to know them, because there are some really wonderful books and articles coming out, and they're being recognized. Thank goodness. I think that the book's cover, if you can put it up again, and the sort of very predictable, because it was used so often, right? Imagery, that's one of the posters that was very, I mean, that's, you know, an image is worth, you know, 1,000 words. And in that case, whether you are putting the words white middle class on the page or not, I think when you see that, it pretty much speaks to that issue, you know. It's
And I suppose Du Bois could say to us, write your own book in terms of, you know.
People are.
Yeah.
You know, and she might ask, well, why blame me for being faithful to my research interests?
Right. That's one of the benefits of the centennial.
We did not claim, though, did we? We did not claim to write the history of the suffrage movement as she does in this book.
No.
One of the benefits of the centennial is that it's bringing a lot of this out that was never brought out before. You know, we're learning a lot. I know from, compared to what I learned back when I was learning about the suffrage movement and what I read, like you mentioned, her earlier book, you know, the information that's coming out now is just mind-boggling. Some of it very discouraging, actually, but, you know, I think that means that there's an awakening, and hopefully that's going to lead to better things.
Great. So I have another question, and I must admit I can't take full credit for these questions and the composition of them. I've had influences from all of you, so just to put that out there. But I'm curious about why these voices from earlier part, you know, in the early 1800s, why do you think they were ignored for any reason, or is it just a historical documenting process that was hard to get to? Why haven't we heard them so much? Why are they ignored? Any thoughts on that? I know we have a few historians in the room or other perspectives.
I'm not a historian, but my guess would be is that once you got into the Seneca Falls Convention and after that, they were documenting like crazy. You know, they were documenting their own movement. They, within, I don't know how many years, they wrote like a 6-volume treatise of the history. And so before that, you know, I imagine historians are having to dig a lot in order to get information before you get to 1848, except for Abigail.
And absolutely, and with regard to African American women, we know that this push toward education occurred, excuse me, during the post-Reconstruction era.
Mm-hmm.
Because prior to that time, African American women were chattel slavery, so they did not have the opportunity to speak their minds in very convincing ways, and if they did, they were punished severely for it. So I think it has a lot to do with who was where, when, how, and under what circumstances.
Think of what Oberlin College did.
Yes, yes. And even Oberlin College would not allow women the right to public speaking, even after having invited them. Yeah.
I mean, along the same lines, I think it's back to the question of exclusion that you were asking earlier. I think part of what we're talking about is how a person frames their own kind of place of interest, right? And Janine, you were talking about sort of and I actually agree with you in terms of what people go to first. I mean, I'm not saying that it's a good thing necessarily. It's just what I've observed happening, right? And in her case, you know, she goes to, in a way, it's curious because there's research she did before on some of these issues, like you were saying before, that are clearly within her view, but the earlier sort of pre-1848, it might be that simply she just didn't place her gaze research-wise in that direction. It's also, honestly, because it's a trade book, also part of maybe a negotiation with an editor about a kind of narrative that would play well, that would be recognizable because people know about Seneca Falls, and that would kind of take them along sort of the story, right? Again, also this speaks to the linearity of the story that she's telling. That would be my presumption as to why it happened. I don't know. Janine, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't have a word yet, but I think it's a good point.
Great.
Come back to me. I'm still thinking about that. I'm still chewing on that.
Okay. We still have some good time left. And for those of you watching on Facebook, definitely send us your questions that you have for our panelists today. I certainly have plenty to keep us going, but I'm happy to bring in more from you all who are watching. Why don't we shift for a moment, sort of bigger picture, stepping back a little bit. You know, what international movements and developments play a role in telling of the suffrage story in this book from more of an international perspective?
I will start because that's the stuff that I think about all the time, because of course my expertise is not so much in US history as in European history. I think there's not a heck of a lot of external context there, and I think it's important. So that context would have been important for both the pre-1848 story and also for what happens throughout, and especially towards the end, right? So some of the things that I wish you would have brought up, because they're not sort of inconsequential, is the fact that, you know, already in the 18th century, there's a number of outright feminists. I'll just go to the French Revolution because it's the most obvious and best known case, but Olympe de Gouges is decapitated by the Jacobins, the folks who are the most radical left wing, you know, the journal Jacobin, it's named for them. They killed her. Why? Because she dared to say that by virtue of being born a woman, she had the same rights as all men. And that did not go over very well, right? Mary Wollstonecraft, at the same time, she was in Paris when de Gouges was killed She was writing on the subjection of women, right? Those are powerful precedents. These are things that were published in France while Thomas Jefferson was hanging out there, people. There's some connections. You know what I'm saying? And so these are women who, of course, I mean, they are somewhat put on the back burner by other revolutionaries because of their feminism, but they published. And the literate ladies that we are talking about in this book certainly had access to some of these writings and some of these ideas. So they didn't come out of thin air. There's a clear kind of path of working through some of these issues. So I think that's really important. And then towards the other end of it, right? Towards what happens basically after 1900. By 1900, there are international networks of feminists that are truly global. They're predominantly North American and European, but they're truly global. And these networks are indeed populated with educated elite women. But these are women that come from Poland, Egypt, the Ottoman Empire, not just Britain, France, like what we know, right? Russia. What happens in the process of kind of developing these networks is, of course, women from especially Britain, to some extent North America. Carrie Chapman was involved in some of these networks.
The international.
Yep. Right. They were trying to kind of advocate for their kind of suffrage movement, but they were also learning from these other women. There was very much a back and forth, and that sort of back and forth has not fully been explored actually in historiography. The story is still sort of like west to the rest, but there's a lot more of a back and forth that these women participated in. And though they were, you know, as I said, elite, so class wise we can say there's some homogeneity. There's enormous heterogeneity in terms of the cultural discourse. There's these women. Imagine, you know, somebody who was raised in Istanbul, somebody in Alexandria, somebody in Paris, and somebody in New York talking to each other. I mean, these are not similar places at that point in time, even for super educated women with a lot of privilege. So these are important parts of thinking about the international.
Maria,
yeah.
May I say that?
Yeah.
With regard to Stanton,
yeah,
I think there was insufficient zeal on the part of Stanton and other people to be inclusive. And I'd like to put on the table the name of another African-American woman who was an internationalist. Her name was Sarah Remond. She was from Boston, well-educated woman. Her brother was an abolitionist. And one of the things that Sarah Remond did so beautifully was to go to England, to go to Ireland, and go to those places so that she could speak on behalf of slave women in the southern parts of the United States of America. So she did your person's duty in that regard. And yet again, her invisibility is just amazing. Yeah. And the only thing I can make of it is to say that, you know, if you think of Hume's concentric circles and how we put ourselves in the center, our family, and then, you know, this circle just goes on the outside. Some people become the center, other individuals become the periphery. Right. And so we don't search diligently and persistently for measures of inclusion. We simply don't. Enough. I'll add that, enough.
I think if you talk to a lot of people who you know, just had the junior high school spiel on the suffrage movement, you know, there are many of them that probably wouldn't realize there even was a suffrage movement anywhere except in the US.
Mm-hmm. That's true, yeah.
So the other thing I wanted to bring up about the international component that is not a takeaway from this book, unfortunately, but I think if you think about the suffrage movement in the United States, it's a very important takeaway. The United States was, let me see, because I took notes on this, the 18th country to give some women the vote. There is nothing exceptional about the United States. in any good way with regard to women's suffrage. Like, if you are serious about suffrage and all individuals being included in the polity and having full rights, we're not like the cat's meow. We're not at the forefront. You know, places like Finland, Poland, Germany, the Soviet Union, New Zealand, etc., had the vote before the United States did. So the whole narrative of U.S. exceptionalist, I think, it gets really placed in a very different light if you start thinking that way.
I think that is such a good point. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to be on this panel with you, Maria, because I love that point that you make. And I think it needs to be made as loud as possible. And actually,
believe me, I do it.
I know. And I love it. I love hearing it over and over again. But to me, that's why it's important. At least to me, that's why when I tell the story of the women's suffrage movement, it's about the period between like 1912 and past 1920. And it's about Woodrow Wilson's demand that the United States be part of this League of Nations, that the United States be sort of a leader in this global empire. And the United States has to sort of match what these other progressive countries are doing in order to actually lay claim to his claims, or in order to actually follow through on his claims that we have self-determination, we have democracy, and we really believe in these principles. So that's why I don't really think the story goes back to 1848. I think it's about the US positioning in its own global empire, and it's about US position in the world, because we have all these immigrants who are demanding it, and a lot of these people came from countries where they actually had women's rights.
Right. Exactly.
And yet, why did they come to the United States?
For jobs.
Okay.
For jobs. I mean, seriously, like, we had the jobs. We didn't have much democracy, but we had the jobs. We had the industry.
So there's some really huge questions that need to be unpackaged, right, in terms of that economic positionality. But I don't want to go in that direction. But I just mentioned the question because it was an organic question.
No, that's a very good point. I don't think people, I think, a lot of people are taught in school that immigrants all come to America for freedom, for some sort of political freedom, but it's very often for jobs, for some sort of economic freedom. And a lot of those countries are still in various positions of not having enough jobs for the peasant classes coming out of Europe. And there are lots of industrial jobs in North America. So I don't want to get too much into that, but to me, the story of women's suffrage is about these people in the United States who are recognizing that, they're serfs in one context and they're industrial working class in another, and they're claiming their political rights in a broader framework. It's not necessarily about the Declaration of Sentiments, because a lot of those people don't actually have a connection to that American tradition.
Yeah, I really appreciate the comparative analysis and how we're seeing what happened here, in reflection to the larger context of the other countries. So thank you. So I do have a question here that I'd like to get to that came in. Mostly, Janine, since you were just talking, it does sort of build on what you said earlier when you were comparing the two books of the authors, Du Bois, from the 1970s and the one today. And so the question is, do you think it could be possible that the new nuance and discovery of intersectional allyship between various groups in the later suffrage movement could come from an urge to hold out hope for strong coalitions, given that this book was likely written and edited in the context of today's democracy, which in many places appears to be in crisis? So any responses to that nuance?
So the question is, again, about the...
So I'm reading from this person, so I'm not exactly sure of their intention, but I'll try to help tweak it with you. So do you think it could be possible that the new nuance, meaning, I think, Janine, when you gave your introductory words, you talked about how allyship was sort of looked at as messy and really a struggle in the 70s book. And in the current one, it's more of a cleaner, more, we've got this together, we could do it. So I think that's the nuance. And the discovery of intersectional allyship between various groups in the later suffrage movement, which I think reflects African American women and other women beyond middle-class white women. So do you think it helps come from a place to hold out hope for strong coalitions? given that the book was written in a current time of democracy not doing so well. That's sort of my paraphrasing. I hope that makes sense. Take what you will and see what comes up.
I think it does give us hope. Go on.
Go ahead.
I would just say it does give us, I think if the question is, does this give us hope for strong coalitions? Yes. I think it's a big deal that a bunch of different women's organizations that would never have otherwise really felt like they had much in common teamed up and supported the ratification of this amendment. And they included Black women's clubs, the club women who were fighting for a different kind of survival and justice and mutual aid than a lot of these upper middle class women. And they really, the color line was very, very strong. What W.E. Du Bois calls the color line was really strong. It was a world of deep segregation. And yet they're working together on the ratification of the 19th Amendment. I think that's a really big deal. And it does give us inspiration. But it's also interesting how it's a single issue. And after that happens, the 1920s happen. And we have the rise of the KKK. We have a lot of women who are pushed out of that alliance, a lot of African-American women, for example.
Absolutely. And I think that in some instances with regard to building coalitions that one has to push, and that certainly happened, as you indicated, in the instance of African-American women. Throughout the history of the women's suffrage, a large segment of what happened with regard to having coalitions between African-American women and white women had to do with women like Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells saying, what about us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We're over here, see me, hear me. And they pushed vehemently to get their voices heard. And I'm not absolutely certain that that inclusion would have occurred were it not for the pushing on the part of these women.
Agreed.
One thing that I think is interesting is that after going through the transition of going state by state, trying to get suffrage by going to individual states and moving to a federal law, that after the federal law was passed, the states still had a tremendous amount of power, and they used that power for years, and they still use that power. It's obvious that the power is still there. There's still voter suppression. So it's not like the federal amendment was a cure-all by any means.
Yeah, the one place where this intersectionality is not represented, and I don't know much evidence of it, is with regard especially to Native American women, who are very much absent, very much sidelined, even in places where there were a majority population. I mean, there's like really kind of no conceivable reason to not speak about those issues, and they're kind of not brought up. So back to the question that was being asked about hopefulness. Sure, hopefulness is really important, but it has to be grounded, especially in the consciousness that we have today, which is not the same as the one in the 1920s, of historical injustices, of a kind of coming to terms with the fact that not everybody is seen still in this country. Not everybody is still able to, fully participate. And so to be hopeful is good insofar as we also are vehemently keeping aware of the fact that these injustices continue, and so that we don't paint over them with some kind of glowing representation of the past. That's all I'm saying. So I think it's a fine line between being critical and being able to pick up from that messy past some lessons that could be empowering into the future. And I think both the alliances and the lack of alliance are both powerful lessons for how to do this better.
So could we then grant a measure of dutifulness and gratitude to the women because we're beneficiaries of their glorious or inglorious work, depending on how you want to frame it? But is there some way that we can maybe recognize that even though these women, some of them, Stanton in particular, she was pretty indecent as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
But she still brought to our consciousness something that was significant for women's rights. And I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts about that in terms of paying homage to women for what they did do as opposed to what they did not do?
Yeah. I think you're putting this very nicely, Carolyn. I think of the centenary not as a celebration, to be perfectly honest. I study commemorations, and I'm loath to celebrate things that are partly defined by exclusion and pain. But we're commemorating, and commemorating means bringing back into focus and bringing back into consciousness the contributions of these people. And you're absolutely right that being grateful, yes, it's the correct word. I voted today. It's the only reason that I voted is, well, because these people work really hard and some of them died for this. There's no question about that. Did they leave a lot of people behind? Did a lot of leave people out? They sure did. But here we are today, you know, and that is something that we cannot take for granted. But we also cannot simply celebrate in a sense of the way in which the president was talking about patriotic, for instance, history writing and teaching, right? I mean, that is not understanding our past, and that is not taking best lessons. You learn from the past by really digging through all that messiness and really trying to fully both appreciate, but, you know, take a measure of distance from that.
So the poster picture of Inez with the California sun behind her, clothed in white and gold, you know, that's really not the picture of the suffrage movement. It served its purpose,
Yeah.
you know, which was propaganda. They used propaganda, you know, extensively, but it's not the picture of the movement.
Yeah.
But she died for it. So she is somebody that
She
actually
did.
I do honor, and
Yeah, she did
kind of
die for
sense
it.
of sacrifice. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And in a lot of the programming that we've done for suffrage here at Indiana University over the past month, it has been very much about the marking and the commemorating and using it as an opportunity to talk about these harder issues. So yeah, so we're all in a good spirit about that. Just got to look at it, and we need to talk about it more.
Yes.
So we're in the home stretch here of our time together. Always goes so fast when it's such rich conversation. So I think what I'd like to do, if it sounds good to all of you, is to bring it to sort of, you know, the 20th century now, and, you know, applying it. I know, Carolyn, when you talked earlier, you had talked about Black Lives Matter. I mean, these lessons, these stories, the larger context of enfranchisement, you know, and getting past voting obstacles and all that, it comes to light these days. So, you know, how does this story, this case fit into this larger context of enfranchisement? And then if you answer that for a while, then maybe we'll do some closing words and wrap up after that. So any thoughts about the larger context in current times?
So
I think
go ahead.
Well, I think the first thing that occurs to me, because it happened so recently, is we screened a film online called Suppressed, the fight for the vote, that centered on the 2018 Georgia election. And I remember the first time that, back before COVID, when a group of us watched that film in person, some of us left in tears. It was just unbelievable. And I think for people to understand that the fight for the vote did not stop. It did not stop with the 19th Amendment, and the fight didn't stop with 1965 and the Voting Rights Act. You know, these problems are alive and well, and we need to keep on fighting, you know, if we're going to ever get past them.
There's current discussion in Congress because of things that John Lewis has presented.
Yeah.
Rest in power. He was a voice for that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to speak as an immigrant. Let me just say a few words. I grew up in a communist country. People voted there all the time. It meant nothing. It was a one-party state in which, whether you stayed home or voted, it was at 100% unanimous vote for the one-party police state. One of the most wonderful things about living in this country is that I've gotten to be a full citizen who really feels empowered by the ability to vote. And I get teary-eyed every time. It's the most powerful thing that we can do as citizens. I pay my taxes and I vote. Those are my two big contributions in a kind of, sort of basic sense to what's going on. But even though in principle, right, everybody who is citizenship in this country is the right to vote and is supported by the entire system, somebody like Breonna Taylor, what are her rights? What were her rights? To what extent is she somebody who's supported, and her family, in the same way that I feel supported by this system? I do think my mind goes to her now because of what happened yesterday, and I think that going to the streets is possibly what's going to happen. That people really will start feeling more and more that this is where they need to be seen. But going to the ballot is the one thing that we can be thankful to the suffragettes for having bequeathed to us as this sword that we have right now for truth.
And after having said that, Maria, a big question looms in my head, and that is, after the vote, then what? I mean, if you think of the huge disparities between the rich and the poor in the United States of America, one could put on the table, what good has voting done for some individuals in the United States of America? And one could ask the question, why is it that in spite of our votes, we still have this lingering distance between the haves and the have-nots in America? And we still have what I call the ruling class really having their sway in the United States of America, in spite of the fact that we diligently and persistently call for the vote. But I think we need to take a road, a main traveled road along, and thereafter the voting occurs. Otherwise, we just go and vote, and nothing significant happens in terms of this imbalance between the haves and the have-nots.
I mean, of course, my answer to that is that basically the consequence of your vote are the people that you've empowered to go and work on your behalf. And if they don't, you let them know, because they serve us and not the other way around.
I mean, that's the ought proposition that I'm hearing.
Yeah.
The is proposition is that if you think of the urban settings, if you think of Chicago, if you think of Baltimore, and you think of people who have voted year in and year out for certain politicians, and yet the lives of those individuals have not changed significantly. So it seems to me that accountability has to go along with this notion of voting, and that's where my heart is.
Amen.
Yeah, I love these points that you're making together. I mean, I think what you're pointing to, Carolyn, of course, is that a democracy is not just about having the right to vote on a certain day. It's about something richer, about actually equal representation under the law, and that's not always accomplished just through voting, because democracy is about the tyranny of the majority. And that's a fundamental reality that we've known since ancient Greece, and we've tried to work around. And yet there are people who have, like our actual founding fathers, wanted it that way for various purposes, for the sake of rule by the few. So that's why, I mean, so this is not a well-formed final comment, but I do think it's very important to continue to think about how the vote is really important, just like Maria just said in a really moving statement, that we do have power when we have the right to vote. On the other hand, it's not, I mean, just like you said, having a day that you show up and vote doesn't necessarily mean that you have power in an election. So I guess my last word would just be that I think the last time I taught women's history, I had, from the beginning of the class, I put on the syllabus, a paper, and the paper was to think about, to what extent did the vote matter? It was women's history. To what extent did it matter when women got the right to vote? And the whole class was about race, about like the extent to which building a democracy is about so much more than just what happened on election day. And then it was actually the semester that of the 2016 presidential election. And it changed all of us. Suddenly, like, the vote really matters, because there are moments where political system becomes so visible that it's hard to ignore that the political system really matters. So I'm not being very clear, but I think it's important to think about how the vote is only the beginning of participating in a larger democratic world.
Yep. In terms of civic engagement, that's certainly a first step. So that was very clear. Thank you.
Sorry.
Can I just add one more thing before Anne goes in? Because this really ties into what you're saying. Democracy is not about guaranteed outcomes. Democracy is about a process in which you engage, and whose outcomes, if you believe in the democratic process, which is the one that we have framed now, is going to provide some whatever outcomes, might be tyranny of the majority, but it's not guaranteed. And the point is, the power you have is the power to participate in the process, not the power to construct the actual outcome, right? There's a leap of faith there.
It is. It's a huge leap.
And for some people, much bigger because of the lack of representation that they have. You're absolutely right, Carolyn. And that's kind of what needs to hold us together, is that faith in the fact that the outcomes of this election coming up will not be abused.
Yeah, absolutely. It's terrifying to think of the possibility of abuse.
Yeah.
One thing that I mentioned when I talk to various groups about voting and questions about voting is that voting doesn't mean that you always get what you want. Your wants and needs are going to be tempered by other people's wants and needs. You are not, and you and specifically not just your family, are not necessarily the most important people, and you won't necessarily get everything you want. And you can't find a candidate who will give you everything you want. You have to look for someone who gets as close as they can. So I think a lot of what I see right now is people saying, well, this is what my family needs, disregarding that there's a lot of other people there who also have needs and wants as well. Democracy is a messy business.
It is, and Anna, I love the fact that you framed it in the manner in which you did, because in my head, I'm thinking of the common good, the good we share in common. And that gets lost today because we don't have time to talk about this, but I was just thinking, at this very moment in history, in the United States of America, there are individuals who want their way. And if they don't get their way, then we can see what's going on in the United States of America at this very moment.
Yeah.
Which has a chilling effect on me.
We live in a very pluralistic society, and there's a lot to think about. And you all have given us a lot to think about today as well. Thank you so much. Any other last closing thoughts?
Go vote now.
Yes.
Yeah.
And think of the common good, the good we share in common. It keeps the country together.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you all so much. And I will add into the voting, iu.turbovote.org is a great place to go if you're looking for a place to go register and help get you moving toward the voting process. So I can't thank you all enough. This was so exciting. I was so delighted to be invited to be a part of this. You all are amazing in what you do in your own niches, and coming together really was a incredible synergy that is very special at this significant 100-year marker, as we know. And we're still
thank you.
Thank you, and it was a joy to be with everybody.
Yes,
it's a lot of fun.
I just wanted to say a few more closing thoughts, if that's okay. First of all, I know in our meetings we talked about continuing the conversation, and there might be people watching, continuing it as well. We did get a question at the very end, right when we were closing, so I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to it, but it's on Facebook. We could respond to that. If you want to contact us to continue any aspect of the conversation, you can find our public email addresses. That should be easy to do. That seems like a nice way to do that. Just so thankful for all of you and all of the units that you're associated with to help. A lot of the behind the scenes people, Tracy B. from the Themester, Gerard Ponikook and Joe Hyland from Arts and Humanities Council, and Joey Meyer, the graduate assistant, all helping behind the scenes to make this work. We hope today's conversation sparks some new insights and inspires you and others to be sure to register to vote and get to the polls, like we just said. And thank you again for being with us today. And we hope you all have a great night. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.